Welcome, everyone. We're excited that you're here. My name is Nancy Wilansky, and I am the Executive Director of Grantmakers Council of Rhode Island, which is the statewide philanthropy network. I am really thrilled to have continued partnership with United Way of Rhode Island on this annual nonprofit survey. We started it in 2020 in partnership with FIO Partners, and then continued with partnership with United Way. We started the survey as a impact of COVID on nonprofits survey, and this year we have morphed it into a larger kind of state of the sector reporting. So much has happened in the last few years that I think it's really important that we get a broad understanding of the work and the challenges facing the nonprofit sector. So thank you to all of the nonprofits that participated in this survey. We're really glad you're here and really glad to be able to get some data so that we can help to tell your story. You can go to the next slide. The folks that are going to be on the presentation today are some of the folks that have worked on the survey. Dr. Adama Brown from United Way of Rhode Island is the Director of Data Analytics and Learning, or I just changed your title, so congratulations, you now have a new title, Adama. What is your actual title?
Director of Research and Data Analytics.
There you go, which sounds much better that way. Sharon Cho is a member of the Data and Analytics team at United Way, and Rakia Islam is supporting the work of Grantmakers Council. So really appreciate all the work that the team has done in putting this together. You can go to the next slide. Also wanted to do a thank you to Rhode Island Foundation, United Way, and GCRI for providing gift cards as a participant incentive, and also to the many funders, AFP, Rhode Island, and the Nonprofit Resource Center design team and our advisory clusters for helping to distribute the survey really widely. We were able to release a small portion of data for Giving Tuesday, and we're glad to see that get some traction in the press through WPRI, WPRO, Providence Business News, all covered those initial results and hopefully help to drive some more attention to the need for public support for nonprofits across the state. So as a follow-up to the survey, I'll send out a link to the Providence Business News article if anyone is interested. We're going to go through the survey. There's a lot of information, so I hope that you can stick with us. We may have time for questions at the end, but you can, if not, you can still put your questions in the chat and we'll be monitoring the chat. We also have set up a Jamboard, which Rakia is going to put the link into the Jamboard, where you can make notes of, this fact should really be highlighted for policymakers, or this fact is really important for funders to understand. You can also put in your questions and any other surprises, things that are surprising to you. We have different pages of the Jamboard that you can go ahead and give your feedback in. So if you go to click on the link and you're not familiar with Jamboard, there's a little icon on the left that looks like a little post-it, and you can click on that and then just write on the page that you're responding to. So please feel free to use that throughout the presentation. We'll be checking in on that as well. And if you have specific questions, feel free to do that in the chat itself. So and again, if you just joined, feel free to put your name and organization in the chat so we know who's in the Zoom room. And with that, I will turn it over to Adama.
Thanks, Nancy. So just want to talk a little bit and reiterate more about the methodology. One thing that Nancy has already pointed out is that this survey really builds on previous surveys that we conducted in 2020 as well as 2021. Those first two surveys really looked at the impact of COVID-19 on the nonprofit sector. And with this particular survey, we really tried to move more toward a comprehensive look of the Rhode Island nonprofit sector. And this is something that we hope to continue to do for some time to come, so that we really get a really good understanding of what is going on in the Rhode Island nonprofit sector. The survey questions, really reflect a lot of the issues facing the sector. And I'd also say too that it reflects a lot of the learnings that GCRI as well as United Way have gleaned over the last year. I know that in our respective roles, we have done a lot to connect with the sector, with various community partners, and trying to learn more about challenges, issues, successes even of the sector. And this particular survey helps us to go a little bit deeper in doing that as well. This would not have been possible without the numerous partners. In fact, there were 16 organizations that helped to distribute this survey between October 12th and November 4th. It was distributed electronically. And again, just to reiterate, Nancy, we are really grateful for all of those folks who helped put the survey out there, as well as those who participated. And in terms of topics, we cover a lot of ground in the survey. We're going to cover a lot of ground today. The topics include a little bit about the continued impact of COVID-19, look at financial health, staffing, volunteerism, racial equity, policy and advocacy, a little bit on environmental issues and climate change, as well as ADA accessibility and capacity building.
And to give a context as to the participants of the survey, we received a total of 301 responses, from which we were able to identify 288 distinct organizations. A big chunk of folks were from the Metro Providence County area, and this is the general laydown of how folks responded as to their locations. These are the 5 major core cities that we see here. And the major top 5 focuses that we received in the survey were arts and culture, a whopping 20%, a good fifth. Education or youth development was another major chunk of folks. Basic needs, housing, food insecurity, economic insecurity was another major focus, as well as behavioral health and environment, climate, and conservation. And with regards to the spread of nonprofits who helped us with our survey this year, a big chunk were smaller nonprofits, while we did have a good amount of folks also responding from larger nonprofits with larger budgets. So we really did see responses from across the board, thankfully.
We are continuing to see impact of COVID-19. So in some parts of the world, we are acting as if COVID is over, and hopefully we won't see a bad surge again this winter, but the effects of COVID are still being seen and felt by nonprofits around the state. We are identifying a continued high level of need in the community and demand for services. Nonprofits are still functioning and delivering services in multiple ways that they began during the beginning of the pandemic. We're seeing extensive staff burnout and turnover. There are continued illness-related staffing absences, which affect planning as well as implementation of programs and services. And there's continued reduced attendance at in-person programs, which particularly affects, say, the arts and culture space as well as education, some of which can be delivered remotely and some of which is struggling to rebound from people's caution about being in large groups. So throughout the presentation, we'll be sharing some of the comments that we received in the survey. In each section of the survey, we asked for, we gave the opportunity for general comments, as well as what would be helpful for nonprofits in addressing capacity issues that were raised in that particular topic. So throughout the presentation, we'll be sharing kind of, this is our storytelling portion woven throughout the data. So there's definitely was articulated that there's a greater demand for services and basic needs even now, as most people think that the brunt of the pandemic has receded. The shortage of staff and the demand for service, just to read two of the quotes, demand for services is dramatically higher. COVID-19 emergency funding has ended. Donations are significantly lower than during the height of the pandemic, yet more people are seeking primary behavioral health and dental care. Patients whose care was deferred during the height of the pandemic now need to be seen, and personnel shortages, paid and volunteer, are exacerbating delivery of care. Staff burnout, exhaustion, staff leaving to make higher wages, shortage of staff and struggles with hiring, increased demand to meet basic needs, more specifically food. So there's a confluence of factors that may not be directly related to current outbreaks of COVID, but are ongoing implications of the pandemic.
So one of the questions that we asked the participants and respondents was, what are the primary needs you currently see in the communities that you serve? And as you can see by the graphic here, of the 278 people who responded to this particular question, we find that the top 5 primary needs are around affordable housing and homelessness, behavioral mental health, inflation, increased cost of living, education, as well as food insecurity. So Rhode Island communities are still struggling, and still particularly struggling with this kind of cascading impact of the pandemic. And in terms of life kind of after COVID, another question that we asked was, how does the current demand for your programs or services compare with pre-pandemic before March 2020? And one thing that we see is that, or the question that we were kind of getting at is, how are they actually meeting the needs and so forth? How has that changed since 2020? And we could see from this particular graphic that our nonprofits are more important than ever before in the Rhode Island ecosystem. And in fact, according to these survey results, we're seeing that nonprofits are experiencing an increased demand for their programs compared to pre-pandemic.
And a few quotes that we've received, COVID's still really disruptive. This organization had to cancel an entire summer youth program when 2 staff tested positive, but scrambled to get and train virtually support staff. We've had repeated staff turnover, far more than previously, and it was difficult to find, hire, afford new staff. All this disrupted services a great deal, and we continue to have trouble recruiting and retaining staff. The performing arts audiences have not yet come back in full force. In-person education classes are still smaller scale than they were pre-pandemic to mitigate participant risk. And children's social interaction skills are lacking. School-age children are behind academically. Increases in substance abuse, increased number of folks using our housing services for the homeless.
Also, in terms of this kind of life after COVID, one of the things we were interested in is how programs and services are being offered. As you can see from this graphic, that majority are continuing to are offering services primarily both in person and virtually. And when we kind of broke this down even further, we found that the majority of staff, with the exception of operations staff, are working both in person and virtually. We also found that 65.5% of program and intake staff, as well as 68.62% of administrative staff and 62% of leadership and management are working in a hybrid way. And so there are less than 10% of all staff who remain remain fully virtual.
Just to respond to someone's request in the chat, we will be sharing these slides at the end of the presentation. We also wanted to highlight the unexpected ways that COVID allowed some good things to happen. So I invite you to take a moment to read through some of the quotes. I'm just going to read a few. Continued public program delivery in online formats, participating in more online panel discussions with peers in the field. We will have hybrid support groups, allowing people to attend who cannot come in person. Focusing more on mental health of youth and the vast inequality in our education system. These are all daunting and should not be happening in this day and age, yet here we are again. Next slide, please. Okay. We started a food pantry and we are committed to keeping it going. We also started hybrid and virtual programming, and we're committed to using that as a secondary program delivery method. Another quote, another respondent said, we shifted from a center-based program to only a home and community-based program. Prior to the pandemic, we did both. So as you can see, there were definitely silver linings that emerged out of the pandemic.
During the initial phases of the pandemic, many funders responded by making adjustments to their grant-making practices. And they were working to make funding more accessible to organizations working on the front lines. We asked how much of that has continued. The number of funders made adaptations towards a more trust-based philanthropic approach with streamlining things, general operating support, things like that have really been important to nonprofits over the last few years. So we really wanted to see how much of that has continued because of its value to the nonprofits. And about a third of the respondents said that they have seen continued funder flexibility and openness to general operating support. It is interesting to notice there were about 15% who said that their funders did not make adjustments during the pandemic, but we saw a lot of appreciation for those funders that did and continue to do so.
Next, we want to highlight some of the challenges that the sector faces, particularly around financial, staffing, racial equity, as well as organizational capacity challenges. So one of the questions we asked was, what are the primary challenges currently facing your organization? And we found that, and you can see here that finances remain a top challenge for the sector, followed by organizational capacity, as well as staff recruitment and hiring. And as far as finances go, the majority of nonprofit organizations report that their finances are the same or better than pre-pandemic, but some of this may be due to the influx of pandemic-related funding, as we can see on our next slide. So here we asked what is the organization's financial status, and while the percentage operating at a deficit has remained relatively steady at about 16 to 17%, the number of organizations with a surplus is decreasing as COVID resources tend to dry up. In 2020, we said that it was like 40% in 2020. In 2022, 31%, and then 25% anticipated this in 2023. And so many of those organizations that are not currently operating at a deficit are also operating at a razor-thin margin.
About 40% of organizations responded that they have 3 months or less of cash operating reserves, and only 26% have more than 6 months of reserves. This has significant implications not only for long-term sustainability and the ability to weather changes in funder priorities or decreased individual giving because of inflation. It also means that these organizations may not be able to access federal, state, or private funding that is done on a reimbursement basis. If the funder only provides grant funding on a 3-month, 6-month, 9-month reimbursement basis for a project, it means that the organization needs to have enough money to upfront that 3, 6, 9 months of program costs. And this is untenable for most small organizations and most BIPOC-led organizations because they are working in this under 3 months of cash reserves. So while some of these organizations may be really well positioned and have the expertise to do work, particularly in BIPOC communities and communities disproportionately affected by COVID, so they may be the best position to do that kind of work, they are not going to be able to access federal, state, or private funding that is working on a reimbursement basis. So this is one of the reasons that the Department of Health is undertaking a deeper analysis of the sector to determine if there are structural changes that can be made to address these kinds of issues, but it is something for funders to consider as funding protocols are implemented. Who is being excluded from that funding on the basis of not having enough cash reserves in order to upfront the program costs for that time.
Nancy, just before we move on, there is a question in the chat. Do you have this cash reserve filtered by size of organization or type?
We will be doing some disaggregation of data. At this point, we haven't disaggregated, but we have plans to do so. So we will be looking at that more. And correction, we're working with EOHHS and RIDO as part of that process.
And speaking of inflation, inflation has not only increased the demand for basic needs services from our communities, but it has also added additional costs and challenges for nonprofits to do the important work that they're doing for the communities. 80% of organizations reported increased expenses, which has caused a 20% scale back on purchases and 15% to even implement hiring freezes. And even more concerning, as you can see in the orange box, 27% of organizations have seen a decline in individual giving as donors struggle with their own increased expenses. And so the organizations in the survey reported that many are working with a very small individual donor base. In fact, more than half in the little orange box, that's approximately 55%, had 100 or less donors, compared to 17%, which are 51 to 100, just like within that range.
We found that a majority of nonprofits are having some contribution from corporations or businesses, which was really encouraging to hear. And thank you to our business partners who are on the call, with 64% receiving grants or monetary donations, and almost 60% receiving in-kind donations. About 55% have had corporate or business sponsorships for events or programs, and about a little more than a quarter have board members who are local business people. The more challenging and more intensive partnerships still are have a smaller uptake at this point for volunteer projects at a business site, or working together on volunteerism. And so just an encouragement for nonprofits to be thinking strategically and proactively about, there are lots of corporate groups that are interested in doing volunteering, but it's really important to have a good match between what the needs are at the company, at the organization, with the types of things that the volunteers want to do. So we have some resources at United Way that can help if you are interested in learning more about that. We also asked about challenges that nonprofits face in applying for grants. And the most frequent response was about the how complicated or time-consuming applications are, particularly that they may be disproportionately complicated related to the amount of money that is potentially being offered, as well as restrictive grant spending requirements or a lack of general operating support. One thing that came up in this survey, as well as in some of the stakeholder engagement work for the Nonprofit Resource Center, was the lack of grant writing or fundraising staff. And so in smaller organizations that don't have a designated fundraising fund development staff, it's very difficult for a nonprofit leader who is wearing 12 different hats to pull away from mission-related activities and programs to be able to spend the time to research and to write a grant. So smaller organizations tend to have more difficulty in applying for grants.
We also asked about various staffing challenges, particularly around burnout, compensation, turnover, and vacancies and recruitment. And so when discussing staffing, we need to first set the stage on what the nonprofit sector looks like in terms of employment. Although some of the largest employers in the state are nonprofit universities and hospitals, most Rhode Island nonprofits are very lean. And we found that almost a quarter of survey respondents said they have no full-time paid staff. And nonprofits with 5 or fewer full-time paid staff comprise about 55% of this particular sample, compared to 7% of nonprofits with over 100 FTEs.
I'm sure it's not very surprising that compensation is a big challenge for many of our nonprofits. One respondent shared that staff can't afford the cost of living on the entry-level wages. The cost of living and the high cost of housing in our community is a challenge even at the CEO level. Pre-pandemic, our wages were above market. Now they're just at market, maybe even below. This will be a big impact on our budget and ability to recruit and retain employees. So I'm sure that the theme is very consistent that compensation is one of the big challenges that many of our nonprofits face.
And part of this discussion, we did also ask about the approximate hourly pay of the lowest paid staff member in any org to see what is the current baseline for pay in Rhode Island. Entry-level positions in about 1 in 4 nonprofits pay less than $15 an hour, meaning that nonprofits are competing with retail and hospitality sector for workers, even though some entry-level positions require some accreditation. This rate is significantly below the Rhode Island standard of need, and only 2/3 of the Economic Progress Institute's living wage standard. And so what this means is that staff members helping clients register for food stamps are often themselves eligible because of their low compensation. And, and considering all of this, we also asked about the approximate salary range for the org's senior management to see what is the discrepancy between the highs and the lows of pay. From these results, many nonprofits are not able to pay market wages to their senior leaders. 16% of organizations have leaders who work for no or extremely low pay. These executive directors are being compensated also below the Rhode Island standard of need and could also qualify for food stamps if this is their only income. And so the ramifications of low pay is a significant contributor to staff turnover. Over 2/3 of survey respondents cited low salary as one of their biggest challenges in retaining qualified staff, followed by staff burnout at 56% there. While many nonprofit workers enter the sector because of the commitment to their community or desire to make a difference, we all know that altruism doesn't pay the bills, especially with inflation continuing to increase the cost of living in Rhode Island. In social service agencies, low wages are in large part due to the low reimbursement rates in state contracts. In other organizations, low wages may be the result of fundraising challenges or restrictive funding that cannot be used for staffing.
It's not surprising that staff in the nonprofit sector continue to show high levels of burnout and exhaustion. And here we have a couple of quotes that were shared from our respondents. Many of our employees feel like they have not gotten a true break since the beginning of the pandemic. Our only staff member just accepted a new role elsewhere. The hardest part of COVID is the shifts in staff as folks look to either pursue more lucrative employment benefits and/or depart due to burnout. Those holding in there are holding on by a thread. It is a shifting industry at this time. Capacity is our biggest challenge. Our staff is working more than they should. Burnout is a serious concern. We continue to find it difficult to secure general operating funds to hire additional staff that will reduce their low workload. And finally, staff got burnt out. Turnover has been high in the last 12 months, and some institutional knowledge has been lost. Staff who have stuck it out are often still struggling with burnout. Also, when we look at overall what our nonprofit sector is experiencing in terms of things like burnout, compassion fatigue, emotional exhaustion, physical exhaustion, we found that over 80% of nonprofits have at least some staff experiencing burnout and emotional exhaustion, with 11% saying that all of their staff are burnt out. Over 2/3 of nonprofits have some staff experiencing physical exhaustion, and this is resulting in an increasing number of experienced staff leaving the sector. We found that 46% of organizations have had staff leave the sector completely, and 59% have staff who are considering doing so. This fact, along with the fact that 25% of organizations responded say they experienced a leadership transition or succession planning this year, and 34% are anticipating leadership change in 2023. This means that the sector is experiencing a tremendous drain of institutional knowledge and a need to strengthen the workforce pipeline at all levels. We also asked about the percentage of paid staff positions that are currently filled by staff who have been with an organization for less than 2 years. And we find here that there has been significant staff turnover within the sector, with more than 50% of the staff in almost 1 in 5 organizations have been in their roles less than 2 years. And only 13% of survey respondents say that they have had no staff turnover in the past 2 years.
A few quotes about this process. COVID-19 decimated a large pool of our employees, frontline and management. It's been difficult to return to pre-pandemic staffing, which has already been compromised by years of low wages and insufficient reimbursement for services. People are also being more cautious about working with mild symptoms, so that is further compromising. There were a number of comments about the difficulty of people being poached from other organizations because everyone is strapped. And so there are candidates that are being recruited from other nonprofits as well as corporate positions. And hiring and recruitment has been an issue even for those organizations that are growing. One organization said that they've had a significantly higher demand for services. Our budget has grown from 8 million to 18 million. We're managing growth and an inability to hire at the same time. We've grown from 85 employees to 165 employees, and we have 62 vacancies at the moment. We've raised wages in some roles up to 20%, but we still can't hire fast enough. And so it's a challenge both in organizations that may be smaller as well as in the larger ones.
As in the quote that Nancy just said, not only is it hard to retain staff, but it's been hard to hire them in the first place. Almost half of respondents reported vacancies greater than 3 months, which can be especially detrimental for small nonprofits who are trying to stay afloat. This turnover represents a loss of institutional knowledge on top of the aforementioned leadership transitions and succession planning that are happening as anticipated for 2023. And the inability to fill these open positions means that the remaining staff are handling additional responsibilities, which is thus exacerbating their burnout. And so a lot of the work that organizations are doing, a lot of it is falling towards volunteers. Volunteerism is a very big part of this conversation. Only 4% of respondents said that they have not used any volunteers, while many organizations across the board, from smaller orgs to larger orgs, are really taking into account volunteers as a part of their workforce. So it's really important that we consider the impact of volunteers and unpaid labor currently in the nonprofit sector.
So there is an incredibly important role that volunteers play, but there has been difficulties in recruiting volunteers. We found it difficult to work with volunteers and interns since we've moved to a hybrid work model because it's difficult to provide supervision in the office, and we're not sure how best to support them in a virtual setting. Another organization said many of our volunteers have had to resign to pursue other paid opportunities so that they could keep up with their own cost of living. There's a lack of ability to form social cohesion among volunteers because of a lot of meetings being virtual. We lost volunteers. The last quote says, during the time that we're not able to adapt to the virtual offerings. So they're in the process of trying to train up new and additional program leaders to meet the rising need. And there were a number of comments about how with fewer things happening in person, there are limitations in how volunteer recruitment can be done, the difficulty in meeting new people who might be interested in volunteering in any capacity in an organization often happens in casual conversations in social settings, and there have been fewer of those opportunities. And Gail, we did not specify any type of volunteer, so that would be a good thing to adjust in the question next year.
One of the things that's really important to understanding the nonprofit sector, and it relates to the various community needs, as well as what we know to be the systemic challenges and issues facing many in the community, has to do with racial equity. And that was something that is important. I know it's important with the work that Nancy's leading at GCRI. It's definitely something that we're centering at the United Way. And so we want to be able to like share a little bit about what we found out about racial equity and how organizations are dealing with racial equity in their orgs. So one thing that's of interest is leadership and the extent to which there is the presence of BIPOC leadership, both in terms of the board as well as in senior leadership. And when we asked about the percentage of the board's leadership of the boards that are BIPOC, we found that the majority of respondents indicated that only between 1 to 25% of their board were BIPOC. And as you can see, actually compared to 2021, there were actually fewer respondents that said that, at least 1% to 25% of their board members were BIPOC. Slide. And when we look at senior leadership and the percentage who are BIPOC, this is where it's, I think, even more problematic, where we see that in 2022, basically 45% has said that there were no senior leaders part of the organization who were BIPOC. I think these findings also speak to and reflect to kind of a challenge or disconnect between those who we're serving and those who are in leadership positions to make decisions about ways to serve the community. And our results here reflect, unfortunately, that disconnect. And despite what we found in terms of like BIPOC leadership, we do know that there are a number of organizations that are making a concerted effort and do have an interest in centering racial equity, and particularly since the racial reckoning of 2020 following George Floyd's murder, have really started to think more deeply about what racial equity, what justice, equity, diversity, inclusion actually means. So we asked the respondents, how have you implemented racial equity and or racial justice values into your organization's internal practices and policies, as well as external programs and services? The top 5 areas centered primarily around staff training, as well as recruitment, also acknowledging and recognizing the diverse history and culture and celebrations of persons of color, as well as making intentional efforts to support BIPOC staff and board members. And also just want to point out too that of those who responded to this question, there were 13% who indicated that they have not integrated any type of racial equity or racial justice values into either their internal or external activities. And we also asked, to what extent has your organization created an intentional recruitment and retention plan to increase the presence of BIPOC leadership and staff in their organization and or on their board? And so we found that there were 19% who said that their organization has implemented a recruitment and retention plan. 28% have been in discussion about BIPOC recruitment and retention plan. I think one of the things that's concerning is that 35% said that they don't have any type of BIPOC recruitment or retention plan presently.
Part of the nonprofit sector survey that we did this year, we asked them a few questions about additional topics where we're trying to get a better hold of what the sector currently is doing, what things are like. And one of the areas is policy and advocacy. We asked a question about to what extent organizations are being engaged in advocacy and policy work over the last 12 months. And one of the nonprofit resource centers focus areas will be providing support for advocacy in support of the sector at the federal, state, and local levels, and creating spaces for collaboration between policymakers and nonprofits. Currently, we do see that roughly a third to a half of executive directors have engaged in advocacy work in the last 12 months, but we do see much lower rates of engagement by board members, staff, and participants and clients.
There are some organizations that have been very active in policy and advocacy. Others in their comments said we don't do this. There were a few comments that indicated that there still needs to be additional education about just what is legally permissible, because some of their answers indicated that they thought they couldn't do anything because of their 501c3 status. So it indicated a need for some more education around that. But we also asked what could be helpful in building your capacity to engage around advocacy. And the primary things were kind of just information and training. We need a better understanding of the way the state government actually works in Rhode Island, as in the actual politics of it, not how it works on paper. Policy research would be helpful, including past votes on similar laws or issues among existing state and municipal elected, similar policies in other states, state agencies charged with implementing specific policies, their powers, jurisdictions, and communication with the public. Some about bill tracking. There was also definitely a sentiment that the overall staffing capacity is maxed out. And so in order to engage in this work, there's a need for additional staff support. Alleviating, can you go to the next slide, Sharon? Alleviating overburdened staff resources would be the key hurdle. Our arts sector does not have a resource to organize around advocacy, so efforts are uncoordinated and inefficient. As a result, we have very little voice on a state level, despite sustaining huge negative impacts from COVID and bringing significant impacts to the state's economy and quality of life. We need to free up enough time for executive director to work more effectively with our board and constituents. It's a matter of priorities. If we spend most of our time trying to raise money, there's little time left for anything else. There's a vicious cycle that nonprofits need more funding, which could be obtained through advocacy, but they can't engage in advocacy because they are too busy with their mission-related responsibilities and fundraising in order to get involved in advocacy. So that is a vicious cycle.
We also asked about currently the approach towards climate change with regards to nonprofits, specifically how organizations are addressing environmental issues. And it is notable that the effects of climate change, as well as the current cost of energy, have led to an increasing number of nonprofits to engage in internal and external work related to climate and the environment. Although with the large orange bar at the bottom, the majority of organizations are not actively working in this area. Approximately 51% said that they are not currently implementing any activities related to the environment or climate change.
Many nonprofits expressed a desire to make their facilities greener, more climate resilient and energy efficient, but did not have the funding to make those improvements. They also expressed a need for pro bono technical assistance and training on kind of what are affordable, sustainable improvements in this area. Although we deeply care about the environment and our members are involved, other issues such as homelessness and poverty are top of mind for our constituents. We're willing to elevate environmental issues through collaborations where institutional partners help us to recruit, maintain, and grow our leaders. Looking for subsidies to get solar energy, training and funds would be needed to make this a primary focus. We care deeply about the environment. However, our facility is old and would require many upgrades to make it more energy efficient and green. We invested major state federal grant funding to upgrade our HVAC system for COVID safety. This has had an unintended consequence of significantly increased energy consumption. We're concerned about the budget impact of looming electric rate increases.
This last mini section is going to be on ADA accessibility. We asked if organizations knew whether or not their facilities and programs and website were currently ADA accessible. And most nonprofits actually did say that they were. 70% said yes, that they have ADA accessible facilities and such, but many did note in their comments that they did not know about their websites in particular, and some noted that a portion of their facility was accessible. Nonprofits who rent out spaces often cited partial accessibility because they don't own the building and are not as familiar with the nature of accessibility within their facilities. Funding is needed for ADA upgrades, and many nonprofits did request training training in making their websites accessible.
So in terms of organizational capacity, we grouped comments into different buckets. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I kind of started too soon.
You can go back to it. One of the issues around capacity building is that great work in this area can happen through an individual funder, consultant relationships, or through external programs like Institute for Nonprofit Practice. But these programs aren't accessible to all organizations, either because the offerings are limited to a specific funder's grantees, the nonprofit might not have the budget to hire a consultant, or smaller organizations may not know about offerings or may not be able to take time away from their mission-related work to participate. But we did ask them about kind of what kind of capacity building would be valuable to you. Some of the things that we asked about are things that the Nonprofit Resource Center may be piloting in the next few years. But many of the things we asked about are additional opportunities for collaboration and creative thinking. One of the things that we've seen over the last few years is the importance of more collaboration and communication and investment in nonprofits' long-term sustainability. So as we have gone through the process of the design process for the Nonprofit Resource Center, one of the main things that has surfaced is the additional opportunities for funders and nonprofits to work together to better leverage resources and develop innovative approaches. So you can see that the Nonprofit Resource Center, people are very excited about that. 83% thought it would be really valuable. And then almost all of the other offerings are above 70%, but marketing and visibility for the nonprofit sector and its impact, information on funding and funding opportunities, professional development, opportunities to develop relationships with funders, opportunities for collaboration and data, as well as mobilization around advocacy.
In terms of narrative, there was a lot of material exploring the different ways that organizations can build their capacity. One of them was strategic relationships. This was a very major theme. There's a need for supports for nonprofit connectivity, corporate partnerships that we had been discussing, connections to and from philanthropy serving organizations, and greater representation at local and state level. There's also a big need for knowledge, so that can be in terms of professional development opportunities for both staff and leadership, including board members, institutional knowledge, including racial equity strategy and implementation, candidate and volunteer pools, etc. In terms of financial health, organizations need support for funding diversification and clear and concise strategies for accessing alternate funders, trust-based giving, supports for reaching individual donors. Again, all themes that we previously explored. Infrastructure, which can cover many things, can cover shared facilities, public relations, marketing, infrastructure, access to resources to support maintenance and ADA, and as well as advocacy. As Nancy had mentioned previously, some smaller nonprofits especially aren't able to devote the time that they want to devote to advocacy efforts. So there's a need for greater research funding, and it's also key that many grassroots organizations are doing work that is essential to systemic change. And so we feel that there is, or at least many of the respondents feel that, they do recognize that there is a part to play. They may not have the capacity to do so though. Next slide, please. So some quotations, we need additional financial resources to support qualified professionals that have the acumen to effectively organize the community and navigate the policy development process. And of course, this isn't cheap. In terms of applying for government grants, which we had previously discussed, this was a very interesting quote because it says that it seems to be purposely designed to discourage small nonprofits from even applying. And finally, we need initiatives to attract and support first-time and early career workers to the nonprofit sector. Ideally, also initiatives to make the sector a more sustainable place to work. Our sector is facing an employee shortage as older employees retire and burned out employees resign. Next slide, please. It is next to impossible for relatively small nonprofits to get on major corporate partners' radar. The sad part of the trend is that, actually, you know what, I shouldn't skip that part. So many companies have recently chosen to move support away from smaller nonprofits to larger nonprofits that are scaled to affect global change. As a result, smaller nonprofits are suffering. The sad part of that trend is that smaller nonprofits are incredibly hands-on, personal, and responsive without a load of red tape. And finally, we need more supportive facilities for small community grassroots organizations to implement their programs and a collaborative hub for a website ADA.
Now that we have covered some key results from the survey, we'd like to talk a bit about some of the key takeaways as well as recommendations. And we'll cover them in these key areas. Next slide. So in terms of staffing, key takeaway is that there's a high level of community need. Funders need to continue to engage with nonprofits as they did early on in the pandemic and work with policymakers to address systemic issues. In the area of finances, there are several takeaways. With the end of COVID funds, there's been increased expenses because of inflation and decreased giving, suggesting that there is a financial cliff that may be coming. Nonprofits are working on a razor-thin margin, and so there's a need to work to increase available resources and to address inequities in funding processes. And also, there's a high level of community need that still exists. This calls for strong collaboration between the nonprofit sector, funders, policymakers to address systemic issues.
And some recommendations, some of which were touched on, are that funders should continue to engage nonprofits as they did in the height of the pandemic, because the need that is facing nonprofits hasn't changed dramatically. And so the flexibility and general operating support that were made available during the height of the pandemic would also be really helpful in a continued way. Looking for ways to increase available resources and address inequities. Really thinking strategically and creatively about how to increase individual giving in Rhode Island. We all know that Rhode Island ranks 45th as a state for charitable giving, and it's really an opportunity to think about how we can support nonprofits in growing their individual donor base when many of them have less than 50 individual donors supporting them. There is a lack of awareness from the public about the importance of investing in nonprofits. Some Rhode Island residents think that the state supports nonprofits, and while there are state contracts, obviously the state is not a source of significant support for a lot of smaller nonprofits. And so really helping to educate the nonprofit, educating the public about that. Continued streamlined grant processes, as well as creating opportunities for connections between funders and smaller organizations that may not have established relationships with both public and private funders. And then general operating support is really key to giving nonprofits the resources that they need to recruit and retain staff and to build sustainability.
Also in the area of staffing, a couple of key takeaways. There needs to be increased support for the nonprofit sector, and there needs to be a better understanding of the sector workforce as an economic anchor in the state.
And many of you may have heard the statistic before, but the nonprofit sector is one of the largest workforce sectors in this state, employing about 17% of private employers in the state. That does include the larger organizations like the hospitals and universities, but it speaks to the fact that the economic impact and the importance to the overall economic well-being of the state to have a healthy workforce in the nonprofit sector. One factor in that is the reimbursement rates and state contracts needing to be increased. Right now, there is an Office of Health Insurance review in process. That is a public process. So if you are interested in that, you can reach out to the Office of the Health Insurance Commissioner. Looking to develop creative solutions to support nonprofit staff, particularly in access to health and mental health benefits, continuing expanded student loan forgiveness. There are programs that other states have tried to really provide additional support for entering the nonprofit sector that may be beyond just the paycheck. And so looking into that. Increasing individual giving, the need to pay living wages within the sector. Altruism does not pay the bills, and so it's important to gain a greater understanding of that. And then making strategic investments in entry-level and leadership pipeline in the nonprofit sector. Right now, except for the subsector of health, the state has not invested in the workforce pipeline in the sector. And so that is an opportunity for growth.
So one of the takeaways as it relates to advocacy is that there are opportunities for structural change.
There are a number of advocacy efforts that are happening on the federal level that Rhode Island nonprofits are just starting to get involved in, and there are opportunities for you to make an impact in the short term. Right now, there is an effort to extend, renew the universal charitable deduction, which was instituted during the pandemic and expired. And it demonstrably increased the number of small gifts in the sector. There's just a national letter that went to congressional leaders about extending that, and a number of Rhode Island organizations signed on. There's also pending legislation about giving nonprofits a seat at the table in the development of policy on the federal level. So working within the executive branch to create an actual mechanism for nonprofits to give input into the development of policy and regulations. there is policy pending right now around IRA distributions, increasing the amount that individuals are allowed to use as their charitable distribution from their IRAs, which may be included in the omnibus legislation, budget legislation right now. There's also a program that was approved in the infrastructure bill that would provide funding for nonprofits to upgrade things like their HVAC or their lighting to become more energy efficient. Right now, they are accepting comments on the structure of that program. So it's a great opportunity to weigh in to ensure that that program is accessible and useful to you in your work.
And as far as climate and ADA concerns, key takeaway is that funding, training, and technical assistance is needed in both areas.
Which is also the recommendation.
And as far as capacity building goes, there are a couple of takeaways. One, professional development opportunities are helpful, but require staff to step away from other responsibilities. Relational connections with funders, policymakers, pro bono experts, and other nonprofits are essential. And then also, we found that strong desire for the Nonprofit Resource Center and collaborative ecosystem is something that is desired, and this is desired over a competitive environment where our resources are limited.
In the capacity building space, we have an opportunity for extensive collaboration through the upcoming Nonprofit Resource Center. Would love to have nonprofits be involved in the continued iterative development of the center, and want to thank everyone who has been involved, whether you served on an advisory cluster or whether you came to public input sessions, answered a survey. We engaged over 400 different folks from the nonprofit sector, consultants, funders in that process. But the plan is to continue to pilot something late spring or summer next year, but to have it be a continued process of learning and growing as a sector. So not having things set in stone and being really responsive to the sector. So that is an opportunity for both funders and nonprofits to be involved in that work. But there are also lots of opportunities to work together, even just communicating what resources are already available. A number of funders offer capacity building programming that is excellent, but may not be, nonprofits may not know about it. And so how can we increase the understanding about what's available? Just a plug, if you are not currently subscribed to the GCRI nonprofit newsletter, that is one way to find out about it, but also sharing with us things that you know about in your networks and parts of the world that we can share more widely to make sure that nonprofits across Rhode Island are able to take advantage of resources that you have found helpful. And then there are ways that we need to work together to develop new ideas and structures that can be helpful to both build sustainability and resilience, but also to address systemic inequities and practices that are harmful. And so look forward to continued discussion with all of you about those things.
And finally, I want to talk about takeaways and recommendations as it relates to racial equity. I think it goes without saying that there are a number of racial disparities that can be found here in this state, whether it's around economics, housing, education, and so forth. But one of the things that was pretty apparent from this survey is that the leadership is not reflective of the communities who are served. And so one recommendation as far as to really kind of foster that connection is to look at more investment in BIPOC-led and BIPOC-serving organizations. I can say that United Way, our next RFP, will do just that, centering racial equity, and also making it an opportunity for those who are successful at funding and being on a journey where it relates to racial equity and doing more than just talking about it, but working together and partnering to create innovative ways to make sure we move toward racial equity and try to dismantle the systemic challenges that we face.
And obviously a recommendation is greater investment in BIPOC-led and BIPOC-serving organizations. There are many studies that have been done nationally about the historic underinvestment in organizations led by people of color. We are hoping to be able to get some more information about the current status of that in Rhode Island. So we'd love to have funders work with us to help do some of that mapping. But we are also have joined together with Candid, which is the organization behind GuideStar, on a demographics via Candid program where we are going to be encouraging all nonprofits in the state, including funders, to include demographic information in your your GuideStar profile. And so you'll be hearing more about that in the coming weeks, but that will help us to give a better sense of understanding of organizations that are or are not led by people of color, and will help us get a better understanding of funding directions in that. I also just wanted to mention back with capacity building that Institute for Nonprofit Practice is currently accepting applications for their next cohort, and they have opened it up again without the normal cost. So I encourage people who are interested in their own professional development to consider that as well.